My name is Dr. Kanika Bell, and I am a licensed psychologist in clinical and forensic psychology. I am also an associate professor at Clark Atlanta University, where I teach a course in forensic psychology every semester. And we spend a good amount of that time in that course concentrating on true crime material. Georgann Hawkins is, of course, widely believed to be one of the many victims of Ted Bundy. Some people have questioned whether or not he was actually her killer, as he gave a good amount of information about her death and stated that some remains of hers could be found. And when they did some examination of those remains, they weren't quite able to place her with those remains. But it is widely believed that she was murdered by Ted Bundy. And what is probably most interesting about that is how similar she was to the rest of Ted Bundy's victims. Not only did he confess to her murder, she also really fit the profile of victim. And we often don't think about victims having profiles, but in the Ted Bundy case, Georgann Hawkins is a classic example of that. Long brown hair parted in the middle, resembling strangely his ex-girlfriend, Ted Bundy's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie. And because she fit that criteria and was murdered in Washington around the time when it was believed that Ted Bundy was kind of picking up and beginning a bit of a spree in his killings, it is certainly understood and largely believed that he is the one that ended her life. A lot of what we now know in terms of our profiling information actually came from the Ted Bundy case and from Georgann Hawkins and similar victims to her. The fact that she was very similar to his other victims certainly suggested that that was a signature of this particular killer. And the ability to identify a signature is not just interesting fodder for people who follow true crime stories. It really is something that is helpful for people who are trying to solve these murders, understand just kind of getting into the mind of the killer and hopefully staving off any future murders. And so that was an important part of this case, but also he was certainly a classic serial killer, someone who committed a murder and then kind of regrouped, plotted, planned, and executed another murder. But around the time that Georgann Hawkins was killed, we started to see him pick up a little bit. And among people who do this work, sometimes we might say something like he was getting a thirst for it. He was starting to get into it. And what that means is that they might even go outside of their normal boundaries, that concept of being a serial killer, and go on what we call killing sprees, killing rapidly within shorter periods of time, because either they're getting away with it, they're seeing more victims that fit, their desired profile, or, whatever they're getting, whatever the reward is they're getting from committing these crimes, they're really getting a taste for it. And so Georgann Hawkins kind of fit right into that framework. Something else we learned about the case too is that Ted Bundy at different times was involved in some ways in his own police pursuit. And so now what is often popular is that law enforcement will purposely sometimes stage an event because they know that many killers like Ted Bundy of this kind of, killing at this magnitude, they do things like return to the scene of the crime, either to retrieve souvenirs like he did for Georgann Hawkins, or to do something to dehumanize the body, or to move things around, or even to do something that they think might reduce their chance of capture. So sometimes returning to that scene or engaging the public in a pursuit of a killer could actually flush that killer out. Something that is extremely interesting too is that Ted Bundy was a handsome man. I mean, he was charming. What a lot of people are thinking is, why aren't women more careful? In hindsight, I think we talk a lot about killings. How do people go off with someone? How is he approaching people? But we're talking about somebody with education and charisma and good looks. And he often used this ruse, pretending to be injured. Many popular Hollywood films have kind of borrowed a page from his notebook. He often pretended that his leg or his arm was injured and he needed some help. And he preyed upon young women who were kind. And here is someone who is charismatic, good looking, seemingly well educated, asking you for some help to put some books or something into a van. And many of these young women said, sure, I'll help out. And with Georgann Hawkins, it was just alarming how quickly she disappeared. I mean, she's coming out of one fraternity house on her campus, going down the alley into her own sorority house, and it seemed like a matter of seconds. I mean, people said they had literally just seen this young woman. So it stands to reason that her encounter with Ted Bundy was so calculated, and he did such an excellent job of sneaking up on her and removing her from sight, that it just seemed like she disappeared in thin air. The importance of this case and just Ted Bundy in general is he's one of the most, and I use this term very carefully, celebrated serial killers in history. Everyone knows who Ted Bundy is. His murders were years and years ago in the United States, and globally. He is one of the most known figures. And because of that, people are so curious, right? He is always referenced in any textbook that talks about criminology, criminal profiling. He is always the subject of interesting documentaries. Even when they're on other killers, they compare them to Ted Bundy, because here we had someone who seemed just kind of extraordinarily ordinary, just a regular guy who was able to commit such heinous crimes. He was even able to escape the police. He was caught. He was using his real name when he was encountering women. Multiple women came forward with an accurate description of him. The drawings looked just like him, saying they met a guy named Ted, and he was still actively involved in his own search. And once he was brought in by the police, he was actually able to escape the police. So by this point, I think what's interesting about him is that he was kind of psychopath personified. He was absolutely enjoying himself, not just in the kills, but on the fact that he could get away with this at this magnitude, that he could become absolutely infamous for kind of pulling off what many still believe is one of the greatest murder capers of our time. Ted Bundy is the perfect case to teach a class about this kind of material. He absolutely meets criteria when you're talking about a disorganized versus an organized killer, the kinds of things that college students and graduate students learn about when they're in a class that focuses on criminal profiling. What kind of psychopath is it? What are the commonalities among the victims? So anyone who is testing their skills in profiling, he is the classic case to do so.